Welcome to War of the Words. I'm your host, Wayne Besen. On today's show, we discuss how Republicans use historical revisionism to whitewash history and sanitize their unsavory behavior. Then, we interview Paul Street, who's on the editorial board of the organization Refuse Fascism. Street is the author of many books, including his latest, This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the show. A key reason America's right wing is politically successful beyond its actual voting numbers is because its billionaire donors have set up a powerful infrastructure. This includes think tanks, media companies, and trainings for those who want to run for public office. Anyone willing to spout the party line is embraced and handsomely rewarded with gobs of money and bogus titles, such as thinkers, intellectuals, and leaders. These pliant puppets who slavishly play their roles are paid well to offer the rank and file talking points to justify their delusional worldview. Unfortunately for Republicans, these fantastical, fanatical fib factories that pump out political pollution have their limits. The truth may be a turtle, and the lie a hare, but eventually the quixotic falsehoods sink into the quicksand of reality. Even if you're a champion right-wing sprinter like Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri, the facts will find you and your carefully crafted facade will crumble. Try as they may, one can't indefinitely outrun the truth. But that doesn't stop the conservative establishment from trying. For example, the right wing is trying to rehabilitate the image of Ashley Babbitt, an insurrectionist who was shot to death by police on January 6th as she stormed the United States Capitol. Her goal, like those who joined her, was to stop the peaceful transfer of presidential power simply because she did not like the results of the election. Instead of recognizing that Babbitt was a turncoat terrorist, the right-wing fib factory is trying to revise history and portray her as a martyr. As part of this ignoble effort, Ashley Babbitt's mom appeared on Rudy Giuliani's podcast, the hilariously misnamed Uncovering the Truth. Let's not forget that Giuliani's law license was suspended in New York for shamelessly and drunkenly peddling Trump's election lies, most memorably at the Four Seasons landscaping company. Writer Manny Atico monitored Giuliani's show and found that Babbitt's mom bizarrely claimed, quote, the real violence on January 6th was due to the FBI, the Capitol Police, and of course, Antifa. She also said that the January 6th hearings were trying to brainwash the American public, and her QAnon-loving daughter tried to prevent violence rather than contribute to it. Yeah, right. The right wing often seems to forget that most of us have televisions, and footage of her daughter's unpatriotic behavior lives eternally online. The attempts of Fabulous to recast Babbitt from a zero to a hero brings to mind a Marx Brothers line.
I saw you with my own eyes.
Well, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?
Here is a simple truth. As individuals, we are sometimes defined by what we break into. If we break into song, we are probably a musician. If we break into a store, we are a thief. If we break into a house, we are defined as a burglar. If we violently break into the House of Representatives, we are a traitor. If you've taken action to destroy democracy, you cannot call yourself a patriot any more than a burglar gets to call himself a house guest, or the thief gets to call herself an extreme discount shopper. No matter how many times one repeats such lies, they remain untrue. Ashley Babbitt joins the dishonorable ranks of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Donald Trump as ignominious seditionists who backstabbed America. She knew what she was getting into and got exactly what she deserved. It's sad, nobody wants to see that happen, but she knew, and she did it anyway. And she invaded the Capitol and tried to overthrow democracy. So I don't want to hear any whining about how she's a victim. Quite frankly, it's a miracle that the Capitol Police exercised superhuman restraint in electing not to open fire. They were true heroes who put their lives on the line for this nation. They protected besieged lawmakers, including unpatriotic cowards like Senators Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, while reclaiming our temple of democracy from invading marauders. They were amazing. And yet the right wing is bashing them while claiming they love police. Go figure that one out. President Joe Biden was correct when he said police on January 6th were speared, sprayed, stomped, and brutalized. He also said they were subjected to a medieval hell. He was correct. Ashley Babbitt was part of this barbaric mob that was bashing the blue and working to destroy our country. These brave police officers deserve medals, while Babbitt earned her aluminum box. No apologies, and we must unwaveringly resist any pathetic attempt to rewrite reality. Our nation made the tragic mistake, once before, of allowing defeated Southern secessionists to erect statues and monuments in honor of traitors. And we let them distribute these eyesores across former Confederate states. We've all seen these statues. We've all been sickened by them. We've all celebrated when they've been torn down. These historical revisionists falsely portray these quislings as warriors who bravely fought against the wall of Northern aggression and defenders of Southern heritage. They even went so far as to claim that the Civil War was not about slavery, as it obviously was, but a noble fight to preserve states' rights. Yes, there is a grain of truth. It was over the right of states to keep slaves. Never again should loyal Americans who believe in democracy, freedom, and human rights indulge these unsavory fabricators who promote false historical narratives. Never. Had we properly dealt with the revisionists of Reconstruction the first time, America could have moved forward, and we would not be in the precarious position we are in today. Another Orwellian example of the right-wing fib factory whitewashing reality is the emerging narrative on Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. A fake AstroTurf organization called People for Civility is placing expensive full-page ads in newspapers defending Thomas, portraying this predator as a victim. The ad headline is, quote, an open letter denouncing the attacks on Clarence Thomas, as if he's just some innocent bystander that hasn't harmed millions of people with his awful rulings. It is signed by a long list of familiar African Americans on right-wing payrolls, such as Kenneth Blackwell, Ward Connerly, and Larry Elder. Their ad pitifully and unsuccessfully evokes race in an underhanded attempt to browbeat white progressives into curtailing their legitimate criticism of Justice Thomas. They write in the text, quote, white progressives do not have the moral authority to excommunicate a black man from his race because they disagree with him. Like, who's doing that? This misleading device of drivel aims to slime white progressives while conveniently omitting the fact that 92% of African Americans voted for President Joe Biden, and a significant number disagree with Thomas's rulings. CNN writer and producer John Blake explained, quote, here's my question to people who say or imply black people revile Thomas because he's a conservative. If black people are so opposed to conservatives, why have so many accepted black conservatives such as Booker T. Washington, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice? Thomas isn't despised in the black community because he's conservative. Many dislike him because they see him as a hypocrite and a traitor. Yet many white conservatives keep recycling the same selective stories about Thomas. These stories don't just distort black culture, they carry an undercurrent of racism. Thomas has lectured blacks about the evils of affirmative action, yet he made it into Yale Law School because of an affirmative action program. End quote. I myself would add that Thomas was deliberately nominated to the Supreme Court by cunning right-wing operatives, for the sole purpose of undermining the magnificent legacy of Justice Thurgood Marshall, a genuine trailblazer and true civil rights hero. Furthermore, Thomas's noxious opinion that the invalidation of Roe v. Wade should invite legal challenges to gay marriage, private intimacy, and contraception deserves every bit of harsh backlash and criticism it has received. Every bit of it. No apologies. However, the tell that this wretched ad to rehabilitate Thomas is nothing but cheap, unadulterated propaganda is when it calls Thomas a, quote, model of integrity. Clarence Thomas, a model of integrity. Yeah, you heard it. These family values conservatives are lauding a sex fiend and a creep who sexually harassed Anita Hill and publicly lied about it to get confirmed. This model of integrity also refused to recuse himself from January 6th related cases, even as his treasonous wife sold the big lie and advocated for the overthrow of democracy. Yeah, great integrity there. The ad accuses Thomas's detractors of character assassination when they're really involved in character revelation. The right wing just can't handle that most people don't like what they see the closer they look. But what else can you expect from insincere, disingenuous, power-fixated nuts who claim to be religious yet voted for Donald Trump? A thrice-married serial cheater who bragged on tape about grabbing women by their genitals and paid to keep the silence of a porn star. They also worship Representative Gymnasium Jordan. The former Ohio State wrestling coach was accused of ignoring complaints by wrestlers who said they were sexually harassed by a team doctor. Yes, another paragon of morality supported by the family values right. When lies are not met with truth, they metastasize. The result is an Orwellian outlook that passes through a looking glass. Up is down, black is white, lies are truth, hate is love, and treason is patriotism. The news is fake, but Trump, a man who lied more than 30,000 times in 4 years, is real. We must remain vigilant and never allow fantasy to be elevated to the same plane as fact. If we don't act, society ends up disconnected and discombobulated. Without shared truth, there is nothing but competing versions of veracity. Such gaslighting creates the confusion necessary for an aggressive, motivated, well-organized fascist minority to stun the majority into submission. Once this occurs, they can seize power and rule. That is why we have a solemn mission, an unwavering duty to challenge every last lie with everlasting truth. If we don't unfailingly shine our light on their shameless propaganda, we will be thrust into a new dark age. Paul Street is an author of many books, including This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. He's also a contributor to Counterpunch and on the editorial board of the organization Refuse Fascism. Paul, welcome to the show. Let's begin by talking about your book. You wrote This Happened Here, Amerikaners, Neoliberals, and the Trumping of America. What made you sit down and decide to write this book?
I finally became fed up with the amount of denialism that I was running into amongst often older liberal and left white friends, often older white males who struck me as just doggedly insistent in arguing that Trump was just and Trumpism was just sort of the same old, and the GOP, and that if you were upset about Trump and Trumpism, that you were playing into the neoliberal democratic playbook. And I had become convinced fairly early on that Trump and Trumpism represented a crossover from just the normal same old right-wing republicanism into the territory of something very much like fascism. In fact, I don't mind actually calling it fascism. You can put a prefix in front of it, para-fascism or proto-fascism or neo-fascism. I don't care. I'm fine with no prefix at all. And so much of this book was dedicated to diagnosing and getting at how in the name of God we ended up with a fascist in the White House for 4 years and documenting exactly how, in fact, that was an accurate description of the Trump presidency and what that means.
I agree with you that Trump in today's Republican Party is fascist. But what does it actually mean? Because people will recoil from that word, even though it's accurate. Explain why you use that word to describe Trump and maybe much of today's Republican Party as I do.
You know, I've noticed in public speaking, I don't have much issue with younger people saying that either they don't know exactly what the term means or they actually instinctively kind of sense that it's accurate. With older folks, particularly intellectuals and often academics, I run into a kind of resistance that seems to have to do with an excessive attachment to a classic Coke version with, as I like to say, with mustaches. You know, they need fascism to wear the mustaches like Mussolini and Hitler, and everything has to be an exact template replica of interwar Europe in the 20th century, of Italy and Germany. Of course, it's not an exact replica. We don't get exact replicas in history, but you do have a number of shared characteristics that are just really consistent across the different genres of fascism. I include in that a kind of vengeful, what some academics call palingenetic nationalism, this notion of the restoring of a lost glory that's been stabbed in the back by a liberal cosmopolitan and left elite, and the need to bring back national greatness, a constant, recurrent, virulent othering of people considered to be outsiders and not part of the wonderful, great national community. This includes people of color. This includes gay people. This includes transgendered people often enough. There's a strong undercurrent of sexism, and patriarchy is just constant across all models of fascism. It includes a constant war on truth and facts and common sense, a constant propaganda war.
Well, I mean, that's one of the first things they did when they went after the media, fake news and the enemy of the people, because they didn't want anybody following their corruption and what they were trying to do to the American people. And their message was, you can't trust anybody but me. And when Trump said, I alone can fix it, that kind of plays into the whole, only listen to me, not the press.
Absolutely. Which, and an I alone can fix it also relates to another recurrent theme, which is an attachment to a maximal male personality, an authoritarian of some kind. There's a constant war on liberals and leftists. And interestingly, if this doesn't get enough attention, a constant false conflation of liberals and leftists, so that you just habitually call centrists and liberals and even some conservatives socialists and Marxists and communists. It's absolutely insane. And there's a legitimation of political violence in fascism.
But isn't that a big part of it, though? Because I remember the when he first ran for president, those rallies were very violent. And when the votes were being counted, I lived in Philadelphia last year, and right across the street from me was the convention center. I saw it from my window, and that's where all the major protests were, because they were trying to stop the counting of votes. And I had to face off in some very potentially violent clashes with Proud Boys and 10% and 3%ers and all of these crazy groups. And that to me was a big part of their fascism. They used thugs. They had their own version of the brown shirts. I saw them firsthand, and I nearly had a confrontation with a few of them on several occasions.
This is, I think, definitional, a connection to paramilitaries. And that's the point at which the historian Robert Paxton, who held out through 4 years about whether we could call Trumpism fascism, January 6th did it for him.
Hell of a clue.
That's a clue. And I think you really cross over into fully fascist territory when you will not accept the outcomes of elections and when you trash the rule of law and you cross over into that violent space. And I think that's why a lot of people sort of gave up the fight after January 6th. And yet many still haven't. I still have to argue with a lot of older white male intellectuals who know better. And if it ain't Mussolini and Hitler and they're not crushing a vibrant proletarian communist party that made the ruling class have to line up behind, but I'm sorry, this is fascism.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. And we saw what happened in January 6th, but it's a rolling coup. You could even say there was a coup at the Supreme Court, the way it was orchestrated by Mitch McConnell. There is an effort in states all across the country, particularly swing states, but not limited to them, to put loyalists in place so they can dispute elections. So this is not over. What do you think is going to happen? Because they are working overtime.
Oh, my goodness. The things that are going on at the state level, which were sent up to the neo-fascist, Christian fascist Supreme Court precisely to change the whole entire nation. And you have these plethora of fascist measures in states like prohibiting the proper teaching of the history of racism and sexism, the Don't Say Gay bills, the anti-trans sports measures, the voter suppression bill, the hyper gerrymandering, but also, and this is particularly menacing, the moves in red states, not simply to suppress votes, but literally to cancel votes and to take away election certifying authority from secretaries of states and from local election officials. And literally, they are setting us up. And this is in the category of what happens at the state level, doesn't just stay at the state level. They're literally trying to set up the cancellation in the wake of January 6th. They're learning from this, kind of like the beer hall putsch in Germany, and then the subsequent actually nominally constitutional within the framework of the law seizure of power by Hitler. They are now planning to cancel popular votes and send alternative electoral college slates to Congress in 2025.
There are so many guns in this country, 400 million. And all of these fascists are all about distorting the Second Amendment so they can arm themselves with any weapon imaginable. They are having arsenals in their basements, many of these radical, crazy insurrectionists. How much does this scare you, and how much does this play into their philosophy to arm their people to the teeth?
And a lot of the people showing up at school boards and election officials' homes and offices and politicians' offices are heavily armed. The history of a lot of really angry, pissed off, displaced, petty bourgeois white guys with a whole bunch of arms circulating and a whole media framework informing an anti-truth, women-hating, minority-hating, gay-hating, migrant-hating. Fascists are obsessed with borders incidentally. They always have been. These literally millions of people in their armed. It's really freaking dangerous as hell. And 2024, 2025 is shaping up in a menacing way with all these people out here who still to this day believe that Trump had the election stolen from him in 2020. And they certainly won't believe that Trump or DeSantis, who sometimes strikes me as even more dangerous than Trump, legitimately lost the 24-25 election. And it just seems to me like blood is going to flow. I mean, of course, blood flows regularly in these mass shootings that we have, which actually are generally typically conducted by right-wing sort of neo-fascists. The shooters tend to be younger. The mass shooters are not quite the same profile as the January 6 people who were more middle-aged, but they're all the same.
And there's no comparison. The right-wing extremism in terms of violence is so far light years ahead of any left-wing violence. You can't even compare them. I mean, all the statistics, whether it's the FBI, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Global Extremism Project, they all say the same thing. It's right-wing extremism is the largest menace to this country.
When leftists get violent, which is really not all that typical, they tend to target property alone. So the police station that housed the guy that killed George Floyd did go up in flames. That's true. There was a Wisconsin Department of Corrections facility I remember burning in Kenosha in August of 2020. But they don't tend to target people. The right is literally looking to target liberals and those that I think are leftists, and they have a genocidal worldview behind their targeting.
It's interesting, but I think one of the more underappreciated aspects of this fascism is religion. You look at 80% of evangelicals, white evangelicals, voted for Donald Trump. The Supreme Court and their radical ideology. That, I think, leads to their commitment. They want to see a theocracy. There was a point where they realized that democracy was not their friend, that whether the abortion, gay marriage, you name it, they were on the losing end of votes. And so they decided to hell with democracy. They were only going to get their theocracy through force. And I think that has a lot to do with what we're seeing right now. What is your view?
I think that's absolutely right. And I'm glad you mentioned the Christianity because it's a distinctive part of the American synthesis of neo-fascism. And there are also resurgent and horrifying right-wing parties like AfD in Germany and the National Front in France, but they don't quite carry this embeddedness in the cross. And, Trump, for all his alleged stupidity, showed some political intelligence in 2016. At least on this issue, when he realized that he had a huge problem with on the right because of his rather libertine, not exactly evangelical, personal, sexual, moral history, and he cut a deal with them. He absolutely cut a deal with them. And he said, basically, you guys can have the federal court system.
They also love the fact that he liberated them to say what they really mean. They no longer have to fake it. They no longer, for example, have to pretend they love LGBTQ people. Oh, we just love you. We're trying to help you. No, they don't have to do that anymore.
That's right. The vulgarity of it. He opened some doors for their vulgarity. And you see now this permission that these fat neo-Christian fascists have. You really know who you're dealing with when they go after abortion rights, even in cases of rape and incest. That's like a marker. They're saying something there. They're telling us something. I think the neo-fascists hate gays. I think they hate Black people. I think they hate immigrants. I think they really hate transgendered people. When they're going after abortion rights, they're specifically zeroed in and targeting females. And patriarchy is a consistent connecting link between every fascist movement that I've ever seen.
And it's such a joke when they call themselves pro-life. I mean, they don't give a damn about the lives of women. They would let women die in a heartbeat, and they are. Their lives aren't worth the paper their birth certificate is written on. It really is. I mean, they are proving this is about control. In fact, the term is forced birth, but it's not about the birth. It's about the forced. It's about the forced part.
We're talking about ability to control your own body. We're talking about a physical imposition that seriously limits your life chances and your opportunity. We say abortion rights without apology because abortion rights, Roe v. Wade, opened up doors of life and careers and freedom and opportunity.
The amount of hatred for women, it actually surprised me to some extent. And I've been going to these right-wing conferences and monitoring them for decades. But the view towards women and wanting to control them and just the underlying hate when they cannot control them even surprised me a little bit. The hostility is deep and it's festering. Anytime they're rejected by a woman, for example, we see it with this incel community. Violence online against women and that spews is even greater than I imagined. I knew it was bad to begin with.
Some of these kind of resentments have sort of been papered over the last few decades. And we're finding out how they, in fact, never really actually went away. The fear and resentment that a certain part of the male community has about the advances that women made into the workplace and into educational spheres and into the professions since the 1970s. And also the resentment of the advances that people of color and immigrants made after the 60s and the 70s. They enforce this regularly within their own party system, and it's a mess.
I see a trajectory here. The religious right and this sort of fascist movement, they gained a little confidence under Reagan. That was their opening. And then it got to the next level with Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition. And I remember the 1992 radicalized convention, the GOP convention in Houston with Pat Buchanan and Pat Robertson. And then it took a turn closer to what we're seeing today when Bill Clinton. And the reason they hated him so much, and you see a lot of the nuttiness started there with him, killed Vince Foster and so forth. And they hated him because he was a white Southern guy who had good relations with Black people. And they couldn't stand that. A guy with a Southern accent from Hope, Arkansas, who was not racist and got along with Black people. That is why they hated him so much. They couldn't stand that. And then they went from a white guy who got along with Black people, which was too much to begin with. And then when Obama was elected, they blew their top. And I started going to these right-wing conventions and they changed everything. They started despising America at that point and democracy. That is, to me, the turning point. And then we saw all these hate groups formed after Obama was elected. And of course, it led us to Trump. It opened the door eventually, this hate that was festering to a real demagogue and a real fascist. So they didn't have to pretend they were conservative. They're just full-blown fascists. Now, that's the way I see it, what happened. How did it get here in your view? How did we go from let's say when Reagan was there, when it began, when all these shady characters started rearing their heads, although you could go back to Nixon with a Southern strategy as well. But how did we get here where we are today, where they're openly fascist?
It's interesting. I worked with some of this in my book. And, Sinclair Lewis wrote this fascinating novel in 1935 called It Can't Happen Here. And it was a sardonic play on this American exceptionalist belief that we're above all of that this kind of shit could never happen in the United States. And he provides a fictional portrayal of how it might really have happened in 35, 36. And actually, it doesn't. Actually, you get FDR elected in 1936, and America moves into some ways its most leftmost, New Deal-y, social democratic moment. And it rises to world hegemony and becomes an unprecedentedly affluent and unprecedentedly powerful nation state. That's been that hegemony and that power and that ability to sort of seem to bring more and more people on board started going away in the 1970s and the 1980s, and people started getting squeezed downward, and we got into this situation where the center just couldn't seem to hold. And the Democratic Party itself, I think, is complicit in this process and is very much part of it. It lost its connection to the working class and into the labor movement and into the minority communities. They got so far to the right that they demobilized their own base. I think the Democrats opened the door significantly to the Republicans by virtue of standing down their own base. It's true that Bill Clinton culturally came off as somewhat friendly to poor people and people of color, but his actual policies were actually quite brutal to working class people and to poor people and poor people. And meanwhile, you do have all this cultural symbolic stuff that does drive the right crazy. It drives them completely out of their mind. Secularism, gay marriage, elite presidents being friendly with advancing and promoting women, a powerful first lady with Hillary Clinton. My God, they ran powerful, intelligent women named Hillary Clinton in 2016. I'm not a big Hillary Clinton fan. And then I'm not a big Obama fan either, but Obama was an extremely articulate, intelligent Black presidential candidate and president. It just drove them completely out of their minds with racial status anxiety. And you're absolutely right. That's when the right really, really took off. And they take off, they grow when the quote unquote liberals are in charge. And the sad part about the damn liberals is at the same time that they're pissing off the right wing base, they're not really doing all that much in the corporate neoliberal era for their own old democratic New Deal Great Society base. And so they're sort of demobilizing their own base at the same time that they're really pissing off the right wing base. And the Republican Party has had a lot of its old space eaten up by the rightward drift of the Democrats. A lot of that old corporate pro-business, Mitt and before him, George Romney, Rockefeller Republicanism sort of gotten eaten up by the neoliberal Democrats. And what do the GOP have anymore? They have this hatred. They have this resentment. And of course, they have the South and they have the rural areas, which are drastically overrepresented in our minority rule political system and much more powerful than they ought to be because of our electoral college and the way the Senate is set up. And I could go on and on about it. It's a complicated topic.
You mentioned Barack Obama, and you've written books about Obama, including Barack Obama and the future of American politics. What was your view of his presidency? And you believe that he had lived up to what people had hoped he was going to do, or do you think he came up short?
I knew the Obama phenomena from Illinois, and there was a lot of projection and mythologizing and projection onto Obama of really progressive ideas that actually had very little to do with who he was and what he was about. He was always a fairly sort of center or right, even sort of deeply conservative, neoliberal corporate type of Democrat who always had empire on his mind. And he was never really what many people on the left and the progressive communities wanted him to be. And we saw that fairly quickly with how rapidly single payer and even a public option for healthcare just got kicked to the curb in the first year of the Obama presidency, which, by the way, is a repeat of the first year of the Bill Clinton presidency with their healthcare agenda. Just got kicked actually to the curb. Employee free choice, which would have essentially re-legalized union organizing, got absolutely kicked to the curb fairly quickly. And instead, we got a very corporate-friendly type of market-friendly version of healthcare reform, which, don't get me wrong, brought some real benefits and brought people that I'm personally familiar with that got healthcare that they hadn't gotten before. But it was very, very short of what people wanted. And on minority rights, Obama sort of consistently had his advisors in his ear telling him, you've already got white America completely triggered by the simple fact of the color of your skin. And the New York Times would go and interview Black people and say, we had a Black president and very little change. In effect, the wealth gap got worse. It's a somewhat unpleasant topic, and he was quite the non-prosecutor of Bush's war crimes. Just kind of like it seems like Garland is going to be a non-prosecutor of Trump's fascist crimes. We'll see. The jury's out on that.
Let's hope Merrick Garland does the right thing. And I don't think that we can get to the next step unless Donald Trump and everybody involved in the coup attempt goes to jail or at least is arrested and pays a price, because we are sending the message, you can get away with another coup. We're setting the stage for that. And the second part is we're supposed to be a country where no one is above the law, although obviously there were big holes in that. People with money have a lot more access to the justice system, for example. But if we allow this to happen, where a coup attempt occurs and a price isn't paid, they will believe they're above the law.
There's a kind of gentleman's agreement that goes back a long way that you don't prosecute former presidents, because let's be honest, the president of the United States is the manager of an empire. And at some point in their career, they're going to commit some kind of hideous crime. They're going to be involved in a coup. They're going to do something really nasty. What's new and different with Trump is that the crime that we're talking about is an attempted actual homeland fascist coup against previously normative parliamentary bourgeois electoral democracy, a literal refusal to accept a peaceful transfer of power and a literal total assault on the rule of law in his own country. And I'm starting to wonder, I've been down in Washington, D.C., and I've been glad I went down to Washington, D.C. to protest at the Supreme Court before and after the Dobbs v. Jackson decision that took away a woman's constitutional right for an abortion. But I'm starting to think it's time for mass protest in no uncertain terms, demand the prosecution of these people. If they are not prosecuted, this becomes just our version. The January 6th becomes our version of Hitler's beer hall putsch, and it becomes a training exercise, and it becomes normalized, and it becomes legitimated, and it's a full green light to all the paramilitaries and all the Michael Flynns and all the Roger Stones and all the other dodgy crypto-fascist, neo-fascist, para-fascist characters out there to do this again. And they will. I can't remember how many million weapons you said are out there. Many of them are assault weapons.
400 million guns in this country.
They invaded state capitals before January 6th. We had no business being surprised by Trump's putsch attempt at all. It was telegraphed.
Well, they tried to kill the Michigan governor. They actually tried to kidnap and kill Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan.
I read an interview with the very interesting liberal historian Timothy Snyder on Salon in 2017, in which he just said flat out, Trump will not give up power peacefully. He will try to have a Reichstag fire. Snyder didn't want to say fascist. I don't know why, but he didn't. But that's what fascists do. One of the things that in the hearings that really leapt out at me that I didn't know, that I hadn't heard, was the statement at the ellipse, let the people take down the metal detectors, let the people with the AR-15s come into the gathering.
And it showed he was a sociopath on top of it, which wasn't a revelation. I mean, we knew that. But the fact that he openly advocated for it, now we've got the Secret Service text messages missing, which I find appalling. And somebody needs to pay for that, even if it was an innocent mistake, which I don't believe, because you have to be a complete idiot to erase messages from what was one of the most profound days in American history.
I heard a federal prosecutor interviewed on MSNBC the other night who pointed out that a formal federal prosecutor, that back in the day when they were dealing with issues of recovering lost information from text phones, he said, we went to the Secret Service because nobody knew more about how to recover lost text messages than the Secret Service. It's utter nonsense. And we know very well that the team of the Secret Service team around Trump was anti-Biden and pro-coup, and that Mike Pence had every reason to not want to get in a limousine at the Capitol with Trump's Secret Service people.
Yeah, you know things are screwed up when Mike Pence is the good guy. I mean, that's how bad things are. My God.
There's a cadre of Republicans who mean Republican in terms of the small R too. They believe in the traditional checks and balances of the original founding bourgeois republic that Trump and most of his base has broken with in all essence. They're ready to break with it. This has never happened in American history. It's extraordinary where we are.
And it's terrifying. And we also have a lot going on. The Supreme Court has been hijacked for all intents and purposes, and they just overruled Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision, as you referenced. Is Joe Biden, in your view, living up to the moment we're in to motivate and mobilize people against the fascist threat we face?
I don't think so. He seemed unduly surprised. We had some reporting on how surprised he was on the decision and how quickly it came out. He had no business being surprised about it. He should have been using his bully pulpit and pounding his desk to threaten what FDR threatened quite effectively in the 1930s, to use his power in association with Congress to expand the size of the Supreme Court. There's nothing in the Constitution which says that the Supreme Court has to be 9 people deep. Well, that would require the Senate to participate. That's right. And that would require the breaking of the filibuster, and that would require him to use his bully pulpit power, like Lyndon Baines Johnson most certainly would have, to discipline and get under control this unmitigated right-wing backstabbing cretin Joe Manchin and get things done. Then it was passed. He should have immediately. Rise Up for Abortion Rights shifted immediately. It was very important that we were right outside the Supreme Court on the day of the decision. Otherwise, the cameras would have just gone to abortion rights people crying and Christian fascists celebrating. You could mandate free legal abortions on military bases and on federal land across red state America, in VA hospitals and elsewhere. He's not doing that. He said there's some notion that he might declare a public health emergency. That's exactly what he should have done. He did some good things in an executive order. And then always at the end of these statements, He says, but the only thing really Americans you can do is vote. And quite frankly, November's not shaping up very well.
There's a lot working against the Democrats between gas prices and inflation. Although gas prices, oil set on the global market, and inflation, the president has very little they can do. He's going to get blamed for it because people can't see beyond that. And we're seeing these prices, and crops are failing because of this. It's going to lead to greater inflation. And the entire world as we know it is going to be turned upside down. I fear this is going to lead to increased potential for fascist regimes across the world. What do you think of that?
There's a wonderful book out that came out last year called White Skin, Black Fuel, The Danger of Fossil Fascism. It's by Andreas Malm. They get into this kind of argument with the fascism deniers, and the fascism deniers like to say that, fascism emerged out of an existential crisis in interwar Europe and Germany in particular, the incredible systemic existential crisis that was brought about by the Great Depression. We have every bit as much as an existential crisis as humanity has ever seen, with the potential to destabilize vast regions of the world. It's already creating mass climate migrations, which are driving far right-wing politics in Europe. And much of what we face on the southern border is actually about people don't know how much this is about climate. We have destroyed capabilities of agriculture and healthy living in much of Central America and in much of Mexico. A number of people that are showing up on the border are that. So yeah, absolutely. It's
in Syria, the civil war in Syria was driven in large part by crops failing and the climate becoming too hot for people to live in rural areas of Syria. So there was mass migration to the cities, and that caused a lot of unrest over time. And that helped lead to the civil war there, for example. I mean, I could see a few scenarios here. You look at Lake Mead, it's a shell of what it was. Salt Lake is decreased significantly. We could be in a situation very, very soon, and we're already seeing some of it now, where one of our bread baskets, California, people are going to have to choose between feeding the crops and people being able to bathe and drink water. That's going to but food prices would skyrocket with something like that. If the cities were not sustainable in the West, you'd have Phoenix, Las Vegas, et cetera, moving out of that area.
There's also the problem of fascism demonizing the liberal and left intellectuals who actually have an analysis of where this climate change comes from and what we might do about it. And when you demonize those people and marginalize them and make it impossible for them to be heard, you just leave nothing but a struggle of each against all. This climate thing is sort of intimately related to the very underlying nature of our economic system, which is fundamentally dependent upon ceaseless, endless commodification and growth. And it's not a viable system in many ways as we go deeper into the 21st century. We have to look at other ways of organizing our overall political economy. And when you don't allow the people who know this and who actually have ideas, some of which Biden was trying to talk about today, how to employ people in reasonable green jobs that are about saving livable ecology. People working in coal mines and working in oil plants because that's what we're used to. This is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster.
You were on the editorial board of Refuse Fascism, an excellent organization. I attended a few of their protests while I lived in Chicago. So what do you in Refuse Fascism suggest people do to take back our country and save it from going in this terrifying fascist direction that we have seen in the last few years?
We felt no choice but to say no matter who the Democrats run, as long as they're not a fascist. So, vote. I mean, it's a bare minimum. Historically, nothing much progressive has tended to happen in this country without rank and file mobilization, grassroots organization beneath and beyond, the big major party, candidate-centered, big media, mass-marketed electoral extravaganzas, which are savagely time-staggered, every 2, 4, 6 years, that are sort of sold to us as quote-unquote politics, the only politics that matters. So I don't take an infantile left position of don't vote at all. Vote, but then I want to know what people are doing after and before and, those 2 minutes once every 4 years. You don't get progressive age reforms like workmen's compensation and child labor legislation and the women's vote without, leftists and liberals and progressives in the streets. You don't get the New Deal, the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, the right to organize a union, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set a minimum wage and overtime, without the industrial workers movement and the hunger marches and all that. In the 30s, you certainly don't get the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act without John Lewis, without Martin Luther King, and also without Malcolm X and without the Black uprising. We don't get Roe v. Wade without an everyday militant feminist movement. We don't end up getting gay marriage being legalized we don't get research in AIDS drugs without a very significant gay rights social movement. For the first time in American history, literally, previously normative constitutional rule of law and bourgeois democracy is at risk. The other thing is the climate crisis, which is just off the charts. It's the biggest issue we've ever had. And of course, if you don't defeat fascism, then you don't do anything on climate, and you don't do anything on abortion rights, and there's no social justice on a dead planet, and you don't save ecology under fascism, because fascists don't care about livable ecology. But I'm increasingly skeptical about whether these things are solvable within the constitutional governance structure and the way it's set up in this country. And I wish people would talk more about the charter in this country and how we might reconstitute and reorganize political life. Because Wyoming having as many people in the Senate as California is just absurd. The Electoral College is just absurd. So we have these killing floors built into the structure of our government.
Thank you for listening to War of the Words. I hope you enjoyed the show. Tell your friends and family about us. We are available on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple, and Anchor. Have a great week. Until we meet again, see you next time.